So Donald Trump might declare a national security emergency over the border. It's not an emergency, but there are emergencies in this country. There are things that he could declare one over, and I have 5 that I would like to suggest. The first, the idea for this actually comes from David Hogg, who he was being interviewed, and he said this: if we really want to start talking about a national emergency like the president likes to talk about, 40,000 Americans dying annually from gun violence is a pretty damn good one to start out with, because it is an issue that is nonpartisan. At least I would hope so, considering the fact that both Democrats and Republicans die from gun violence. So I think David Hogg, who knows quite a bit about this topic, is quite right. I think that that is an actual national emergency with an ever increasing death toll. If Laura Ingraham is worried about one terrorist, well, what about 1,000 Americans over the course of just a month or 2 dying from gun violence? That seems like a national emergency to me.
It's incredible how effective propaganda is, even when the facts are presented over and over again. So for instance, when you look at the number of people who have died because of gun violence versus the number of people who have died because of violence committed by undocumented immigrants. I mean, you can't even really compare the two. Gun violence is way up here. But the Trump administration will take one undocumented immigrant who's done something terrible, right? And they'll go ahead and they'll broadcast that to the world over and over again. And that anecdotal evidence for the point that they're trying to make will somehow be more persuasive than the volume of people who die every year from gun violence. Like it's incredible to me that for some reason, Americans think that this anecdotal evidence is more powerful and more persuasive than looking at the numbers of Americans who lose their lives every year as a result of our inability to pass common sense gun legislation.
Exactly. At the risk of not being persuasive, let's talk about those numbers. If you bring up this chart, you're gonna see over time the number of Americans that died due to gun-related attacks. Obviously, you see in the blue suicides. Now those are going up quite a bit, but the assaults, the homicide, that also spiked over the past few years. I mean, you're talking about 15,000 Americans per year dying because someone had a gun and a grudge. And what's interesting is if you bring up this, let's bring up overall crime trends too. Violent crimes per 100,000 people from 93 to 17, they dropped precipitously. So while at the same time that violent crime is half of what it was in the early 90s, gun violence is going up, which makes it seem like it's less of an issue of Americans being increasingly violent and more of a problem of them increasingly having access to firearms.
And committing, mass shootings. That
too.
Yeah.
So that obviously is a national emergency. Thank you to David Hogg for suggesting that. I have another one. And if I were to ask you to name a national emergency, I have a feeling what would be the number 1, that would be climate change. Now we could go to any number of fancy graphics of statistics of the number of people who are gonna be displaced, cities that will be destroyed, economic output that will be damaged, the inability to feed our people, all of those issues. We're gonna be scoured by fires, hurricanes will be worsened, ocean levels will rise. We're not gonna go through that because we've done it a million times, watch the damage report for more. But this is obviously a national emergency. We could declare that as the sort of the impetus for something like a Green New Deal.
And also, if you're genuinely more concerned about immigration or mass migration into the United States, consider the fact that climate change will accelerate that. It will exacerbate that. You will have more people displaced as a result of climate change, more people fleeing their own countries, their own lands in search for safety. People are probably gonna wanna come to places like the United States. In fact, I mean, I'm a little concerned about mass migration from South Florida to other states in the United States, right? Just putting that out there.
Why South Florida in particular?
Because it's Florida, even if it's South Florida.
Yeah,
so,
I get your point.
No, but look, I'm obviously joking there, but South Florida will be underwater by the end of the century.
Yeah, right? I've seen the charts of Louisiana. It is going to be a rough time. By the way, LA is not going to be immune to that as well.
I know.
Depending on how much heating there is, I have seen a projection that in 2100, my house would be underwater. I don't live near the beach, by the way. But you have relatively flat land and you have rising oceans. So climate change, definitely a national emergency. Trump could be a historic hero for the US if he were to set us on the path to actually doing something to address this problem. Of course, he's not gonna do that. Maybe something more practical. He thinks climate change is a hoax by the Chinese. What about something that he can experience just by flying, just by driving? That would be infrastructure repair. Now, we could go through any number of different things. I'm just gonna cite some standout points that have led the American Society of Civil Engineers to rate our infrastructure overall a D+ year after year. Out of the over 600,000 bridges in the US, more than 200,000 are more than 50 years old, which I'm not a civil engineer, but that's not good. There were some 15,500 high hazard dams in the US back in 2016. That sounds dangerous. I could see The Rock making a movie about that at some point. More than 1 million drinking water pipes have been in use for almost 100 years.
That sounds safe.
So that is one of the reasons we have things like lead poisoning, let alone any number of other issues. And also, by the way, I understand this isn't gonna be sexy for Republicans, but a huge amounts of water waste as well, which we can ill afford in many parts of the country. Additionally, you saw there at the bottom, by 2025, there's an investment gap of about $177 billion for infrastructure that supports electricity, like power plants and power lines, which not only makes our country more at risk of things like just lines going down and stranding people without power, but let alone some sort of foreign cyber attack against our electricity generation systems. So in all these areas, whether you're talking about roads or pipes or airports, dams, bridges, electricity, the nuclear plants, all of that, we need a massive investment.
So I want to take a quick trip back to 2016 when Trump was running his campaign. And it is true that the border wall was at the heart of his platform, but he also ran a populist campaign. And he ran a populist campaign coming from the right wing, of course, but he did talk about things that people on the left do want some focus on. So for instance, infrastructure happened to be one of them. So he pretended like he cared about infrastructure. He pretended like he wanted to do something to rebuild America, but has he actually done anything in regard to that? No. First order of business, let's give the rich giant tax cuts. So you're gonna pass tax cuts that cost the country $2 trillion, nearly $2 trillion over the next decade, and you're gonna completely abandon your plans to improve the infrastructure. Another thing he ran on was making pharmaceutical drug prices affordable. He said it's ridiculous that Medicare isn't able to negotiate drug prices. What has Trump done for that? Absolutely nothing. He's taking credit for lowering drug prices, but a story that we didn't get to on the main show, I covered it on No Filter this week, is that pharmaceutical drug prices have gone up this year. In the first 2 days of January, all the major pharmaceutical companies announced increases on their major drugs, okay? So something that he'll take credit for, he'll say, no, I lowered drug prices. He did not do that. He did not invest in infrastructure, but for some reason, he wants to focus on funding that border wall.
And along the way, he has made, thanks to all of his scandals and all those things, he has made the concept of Infrastructure Week a joke.
Right.
So obviously infrastructure, that is a national emergency all over the nation actually. Let's turn to another one though, and you talked about drugs. Some people don't have access to them. Some have ones that are actually killing them. And the opioid epidemic is a massive national crisis. In fact, during the last election, some politicians started to talk about it as if it was one. And then they backed off, and despite his big promises that he would address this crisis, instead, he has pulled funding from organizations intended to do something about it. He has literally shut down ones inside of the federal government designed to deal with that crisis. And he has left us in a situation where every day more than 115 people in the US die after overdosing on opioids. Obviously, far more die overall from drug overdoses every day, but that's just on opioids. And if we go to this next chart, you're gonna see the number of deaths involving opioids steadily, and in fact, accelerating over the past few years. So I would argue something killing 50,000 Americans in 1 year, that seems like a crisis. That seems like a national emergency to me. But you're not gonna see any action from him while all of that's going on, while the death toll continues to mount. One other national emergency, this one might be a little bit harder of a sell, but I think many of you who tune into this program understand why this is the actual emergency that I say it is, and that is money in politics. And the reason for that is, imagine that Trump was to, or an actual responsible politician, was to go on the podium in front of the nation and to talk about the ways that out of control spending in elections, the influence of donors, special interests, corporate PACs, all of that has warped the outcomes we have in virtually every area of policy, including all of the ones that are literally life and death. if we're talking about our healthcare system, or if we're talking about the military, any of these, what we get politically is what is bought by the donors. People die because of these decisions, because of these donations. And to give them an idea of how much worse it's getting, let's bring up this final chart. And you're gonna see spending in midterm elections by year. So at the bottom you have 1998, and you see marching up 2002, 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, more and more, literally billions of dollars. So what are we getting as a result of over $6 billion in these midterms?
Trash.
We're getting trash,
yes.
And people are dying. That is a national emergency. It's not sneaking up behind you with a knife, okay? It's not creeping across the border, but it's here. It's not just here, it's in the halls of Congress. It is determining what the president does, what our senators do. In many cases, what the Supreme Court decide as well. That affects everyone, and I believe that a responsible politician could actually make that case.
When you think about what makes America great, or what made America great, it was this idea of having a government that was by the people, for the people. And with money in politics, you get the exact opposite of that. With money in politics, you are not able to run in most cases unless you are tremendously wealthy and connected. And even if you are someone who's not interested in running, but you want to be politically active and elect someone who represents you, there is no guarantee. In fact, it's highly likely that even after that person gets elected, he or she will be corrupted by these corporate interests.
Yeah.
And so all the issues that we care about, all the issues that we want to see real systemic change in, are never gonna change if we don't do something about the rampant corruption and legalized bribery that we now have in our political system. We no longer have a democratic system in place. We have a system that is owned and controlled by the corporate world and the corporate world only, and we need to stop that.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.